Can you imagine waiting 44 years for justice? Not for some, minor inconvenience, but for the murder of your family. Well, that's the reality for the families in Dehuli, India.
Yeah.
Back in 1981, this horrific massacre just tore their community apart. And it's only now, in 2025, that they're finally seeing some kind of resolution.
It's a truly landmark case. Really reveals so much about the Indian justice system.
Yeah.
Both its strengths and, let's say, areas for improvement.
For sure. And it's a story that, well, just pulls you in,
Yes,
know?
absolutely.
You've got this shocking brutality, the political maneuvering that followed. It's a legal battle that could be straight out of a movie.
Easily, yeah.
So we're going to deep dive into all of that together today. We'll try to figure out why it took so long and what this verdict means, not just for the families, but for India as a whole.
I think you'll find it fascinating and heartbreaking. In equal measure.
Absolutely. Let's take you back to November 18th, 1981.
Okay.
Ordinary day in Dehuli. You know, just a small, quiet village, Mainpuri district. Life's going on as usual until a gang of 17 dacoits shows up, disguised as police officers. Now, you might be thinking, dacoits, what are those? Well, they're bandits, notorious criminals, and their arrival in Dehuli was no random act. This wasn't just some robbery gone wrong. This was planned.
Right.
And the victims were specifically targeted because they were Dalits.
Yeah.
A community that has historically faced, discrimination and violence in India.
It's really awful. The ringleaders of this gang, Radhe Shyam Singh and Santosh Singh, were upper caste. And they believed that the Dalit community had reported their previous crimes to the police. They were out for revenge.
And this is where the caste-based power dynamics come into play.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't just about punishing people they thought had wronged them.
Yeah.
It was about sending this terrifying message to the entire Dalit community.
Right.
A message meant to reinforce, their place in society through terror.
Through fear.
Yeah. And the brutality of what happened next is just, it's almost impossible to comprehend. 24 people were murdered, including 7 women and 2 babies.
It's just awful.
One baby was just 6 months old, the other 2 years old.
Unimaginable.
9 other villagers were attacked and left for dead.
Yeah, the sheer scale of the violence.
Yeah.
The deliberate targeting of, the most vulnerable.
It's just...
It sent shockwaves through the entire country.
Totally. And it's important to remember this wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't just about this immediate violence, but, the historical context of caste-based violence that has plagued India for centuries.
Absolutely. The Dehuli Massacre, it fits into a much larger and tragic pattern.
Yeah.
And to understand the depth of the community's fear, you have to know that 4 Dalit villagers actually testified against this gang previously.
Wow.
After a police encounter. Talk about courage.
Incredible courage.
In the face of such a threat.
Yeah, unbelievable. When news of the massacre reached the rest of India, it wasn't just some local news story.
Yeah.
This became a national issue. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, she actually visited Dehuli herself, which was very rare,
Yeah.
Very significant act.
Huge. Her visit, it brought the plight of the Dalit community to the forefront of national consciousness.
Yeah.
It put immense pressure on the authorities to take action. And it showed just how deeply this event resonated with the country's leadership.
And this public outcry went beyond just the prime minister's response. Opposition leader Atal Vajpayee organized a huge protest march.
Right.
And there were calls for the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh to resign.
Right.
The entire nation was demanding justice.
Yeah, and that outrage wasn't unfounded. Just 12 days after the Dehuli Massacre, a different gang murdered 10 more Dalits in a nearby village called Sadhupur.
Oh, wow.
Which really underscored the climate of fear and violence the Dalit communities were living under at that time.
So here we have this horrific crime that has captured the nation's attention. Everyone's waiting to see what happens next. Immediately, an FIR, or First Information Report, which is the first step in the Indian legal process, was filed. 17 people were officially charged with a whole list of crimes, including murder and dacoity, which is basically organized robbery. But here's where things take a truly unbelievable turn.
Yeah, this is where we enter the often confusing and incredibly complex world of the Indian legal system.
Right.
Buckle up. Over the years, as this case kind of wound its way through the courts, 13 of the accused actually died before the trial could even finish.
Oh, wow.
And then on top of that, one of the accused is still missing. just vanished.
So you're waiting for justice, and the people who are accused of this awful crime are literally dying of old age before they even see a courtroom.
It really highlights this huge problem, a major flaw in India's legal system.
Yeah.
It's just overwhelmed. I mean, there's this enormous backlog of cases, not enough judges, and the whole bureaucratic process, well, it's just so slow, incredibly convoluted.
I can imagine.
It raises these serious concerns, especially about access to justice for, marginalized communities like the Dalits.
So by the time we get to 2025, we're talking 44 years after the massacre. Only 3 men are left to face justice: Kaptan Singh, Rampal, and Ram Sevak.
Right.
It's wild.
It is.
And leading the prosecution is Rohit Shukla, a lawyer who seems determined to bring some kind of closure to this case, even after all this time.
Does, yeah.
I mean, what's interesting is that he invokes this rarest of rare doctrine to try and make sure these men are really held accountable. Can you explain what that is? Why is it so significant?
Of course. So in India, they reserve the death penalty for the most extreme cases.
Right.
And this rarest of rare doctrine, it helps figure out, if crime is really that bad. It basically says this crime is so brutal, so shocking, that it needs the most severe punishment.
So the prosecution's saying that the Dehuli Massacre, the planning, the cruelty, the fact that they targeted these people just because of their caste, that all of that makes it deserving of the death penalty.
Exactly. They're not just trying to say, okay, these guys are guilty of murder.
Right.
It's more like this was a calculated attempt to terrorize, to subjugate a whole community.
Yeah. And after 44 years of waiting, the families of the victims, they finally get a verdict.
They do. The special judge in this case, Indira Singh, she goes over all the evidence, hears all the arguments, and in the end, she finds all 3 men guilty and sentences them to death by hanging.
You'd think that would be the end of it, a sense of closure, finally. But it's not that simple, is it?
Not quite. You see, the Indian legal system, it allows for appeals. And these 3 men, they file right away to have their sentences overturned.
It's just incredible. So even after all this time, even with a guilty verdict, this legal battle, it could still keep going.
Good.
Really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About justice delayed. Can it ever really be justice served?
It's a question that kind of hangs over this whole case. It really does.
We've spent this whole deep dive talking about one specific event, this awful massacre in this small village. But I think as we've gone deeper, it's become pretty clear that the Dehuli Massacre, it isn't just about this one act of violence. It's part of something much bigger.
Yeah, it's like it ripped the bandage off a wound that never really healed, forcing India, and maybe all of us, to face some really uncomfortable truths about the caste system.
And the violence that it just keeps causing even today.
Exactly.
It's a reminder that even though caste discrimination is illegal, officially in India, it still affects millions of people. I mean, every day.
Every single day, yeah.
The fact that this happened and that it took 44 years to even get to this point, to bring these people to justice, it tells us something about inequality that goes way beyond this one village.
It's about power, really, the power dynamics that are baked into Indian society.
Yeah.
The Dehuli Massacre, it was just this horrific display of power wielded by people who thought they were untouchable.
And for decades, it seemed like they were right. But then after all these years, after all these legal battles, there's finally a verdict. So what message does this send? Not just to Dehuli, but to the whole country.
I think it's a complicated message.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it shows that justice can prevail, even after 44 years.
Right.
It's like no matter how much time passes, those who commit these terrible crimes, they will be held accountable.
It's a little bit of hope, right?
Yeah, a little bit. But it also kind of shows these big failures, these systemic failures that let this case go on for so long.
Right.
And it makes you ask, is justice delayed really justice served?
Especially when we're talking about decades, yeah. That's a really tough question to think about.
It is. And then there's the whole debate about the death penalty.
Yeah.
Does it really work? Is it even morally right? This case, it just forces us to deal with these really complex questions.
I think it's important to say, though, that caste-based discrimination, it's not just an India problem.
No, not at all. No. It's everywhere. Wherever you have these systems of hierarchy, of inequality, it's there.
So Dehuli is like a wake-up call, right?
It is.
That this is a global problem, and we need to address it.
We need to work towards a world where everybody Everybody feels safe and protected,
Respected.
no matter where they come from.
So what can we do? What are some concrete steps we can take to try to stop something like this from happening again? In India, but really anywhere in the world.
Well, you have to start at the root, right? The root causes of this violence. Tackle poverty, the lack of education, the lack of access to opportunities.
Especially for marginalized communities.
Yeah, it's about giving people power, giving them the tools to break free from these cycles of discrimination.
So education's key.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We need to teach people about the history, the harm it causes. We need to teach them why equality and respect are so important.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to take time, changing hearts and minds. But it's worth it.
But what about right now? What about this need for a legal system that's efficient, that works?
Well, there are definitely things that could be done, We need more resources, more judges, more courts, more staff.
To help reduce that backlog of cases.
Exactly.
And make sure trials can happen quickly and fairly.
Yeah, make it less bureaucratic, more streamlined, more efficient.
So people can actually feel confident that they'll be heard.
That their rights will be protected. That's the goal.
It's clear that we need more than just legal reforms. We need a real shift in how we think, how we treat each other. We need a commitment from everybody to create a world that's more just, more equitable.
Couldn't agree more. The Dehuli Massacre, it's this tragic reminder of what happens when we don't deal with these problems.
It's a call to action.
It is. A plea for all of us to come together, to challenge injustice, and fight for a future where something like this never happens again.
Well, it's been a heavy deep dive.
It has.
But an important one. The Dehuli Massacre and this whole issue of caste-based discrimination, they show us that the fight for justice, for equality, it's never really over. It's something we all need to be a part of.
The takeaway here is that we can't just turn away from difficult truths. We got to face them head on,
Yeah.
Learn from them, and then use what we've learned to build a better world. A world where every person is treated with dignity and respect.
That's a great point. If you're left with one question after this deep dive, it should be, how can we, each of us, how can we help in that fight for justice and equality? How can we make sure that all communities feel safe and protected and respected? It's something we all need to keep thinking about.
Yeah, it's a conversation we have to keep having.
Absolutely.
In our homes, in our communities, everywhere.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another one, another chance to explore the world around us.
Always more to learn.
Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a better tomorrow.